trust didn't break all at once. It didn't shatter in a loud moment. It didn't disappear after a fight. It cracked quietly. I didn't even know it was happening. I was a kid when it started, old enough to understand rules, young enough to believe adults always meant well. I thought trust was automatic, something you didn't have to think about, something that just existed between parents and children, teachers and students, friends and families. Then came one punishment. It wasn't the punishment itself that stayed with me. It was what followed. The distance, the shift, the feeling that something had changed between us and no one was going to explain how or why. That was the moment I learned a lesson no one intended to teach me. That trust isn't guaranteed, that it can disappear without warning, and that once it does, you start living differently, carefully, quietly, watching people instead of leaning on them. I didn't know it then, but that moment would shape the way I trusted everyone after that. Friends, authority figures, partners, even myself. When I think back to that day, I don't remember the weather. I don't remember what I was wearing. I remember the feeling in my chest. Tight, unsteady, like something familiar had shifted just enough to make me unsure of my footing. I had made a mistake, a real one, the kind adults take seriously even when kids don't fully understand the weight of it yet. I knew I was in trouble. What I didn't know was that I was about to learn something much bigger than right and wrong. The punishment came and went. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, it didn't last long. What lasted was what came after. My parent, my father, was suddenly different. Not angry, not yelling, just distant. Conversations became shorter. Eye contact disappeared. The warmth I was used to felt muted, like someone had turned the volume down on our relationship. At first, I assumed it was temporary. Adults cool off, time passes, things go back to normal. So I waited. I waited for things to reset. I waited for a smile. I waited for reassurance that everything was okay again. It didn't come. And because no one explained what had changed, my mind filled in the gaps. I started asking myself questions kids shouldn't have to answer alone. Did I break something permanently? Is he still mad? Did I disappoint him so badly that things can't go back to the way they were? Those questions didn't get answers. They just stayed with me. And slowly, without realizing it, I adjusted. I became more careful around him. I watched my words. I measured my tone. I avoided mistakes, not because I understood the lesson, but because I feared the distance that followed. That was the first crack in trust. Not trust in rules, trust in people. Because I learned that someone could punish you, withdraw emotionally, and never tell you when or if you were safe again. I learned that connection could be conditional. That lesson followed me everywhere. At school, I stopped trusting teachers to help me if I messed up. I assumed mistakes meant disappointment, not support. When I didn't understand something, I stayed quiet. When I struggled, I hid it. I trusted myself to stay out of trouble more than I trusted others to be fair. Friends noticed that I was cautious, but they didn't know why. I was friendly but guarded, present but reserved. I listened more than I spoke, observed more than I participated. Because trust to me had become something fragile, something you didn't give freely, something you waited to see if people deserved. And even then, you gave it slowly. I didn't connect this back to that punishment for a long time. I thought this was just my personality. Quiet, careful, independent. Adults liked those traits. They praised me for being responsible, for not causing problems, for handling things on my own. No one asked why I didn't trust easily. No one asked why I hesitated before opening up. They assumed I was mature. But maturity built on fear is different. It doesn't feel solid. It feels tense. I remember one moment clearly from a few years later. A teacher pulled me aside after class. I had made a small mistake on an assignment, nothing serious. She asked me about it calmly. but my body reacted as if I was in serious trouble. My heart raced, my throat tightened, my mind jumped ahead to consequences that hadn't been mentioned yet. She noticed my reaction and softened her tone, telling me it wasn't a big deal. I nodded, but inside I had already withdrawn. That's when I realized something important, even though I didn't have words for it yet. I didn't trust authority figures to stay calm. I trusted them to change suddenly, to become distant, to withhold approval, to make me feel unsure of where I stood. So I protected myself by staying small, by not needing much, by not expecting reassurance. This way of thinking bled into friendships too. When people were kind, I appreciated it, but I waited for it to end. When someone offered support, I questioned how long it would last. When I got close to someone, part of me stayed alert, ready for the moment things shifted. Because in my experience, they always did. Trust wasn't something stable, it was something temporary. And the cost of believing that was subtle but heavy. I didn't feel safe being fully myself. I edited my thoughts, filtered my feelings, shared only what felt acceptable. I didn't expect people to handle my mistakes with care. I expected distance, so I tried not to give them reasons. That one punishment didn't just teach me a rule, it taught me a worldview, that people's approval could disappear without warning, that love could turn quiet instead of kind, that safety wasn't guaranteed after mistakes. And once you believe that, trust becomes risky. I didn't stop trusting because I wanted control. I stopped trusting because I wanted safety. I didn't know it yet, but this belief was shaping every relationship I would have, and it would take years before I understood where it came from and what it was costing me. After that punishment, I didn't stop trusting people completely. That would have been obvious. What I learned instead was how to trust carefully. Careful trust looks responsible from the outside. It looks like good behavior, emotional control, and independence. It doesn't raise alarms. It doesn't cause trouble. But inside, it's built on one question that never goes away. What will happen if I mess this up? That question followed me everywhere. At school, I became hyper-aware of expectations. I paid attention to rules not because I believed in them, but because I believed in consequences, especially the quiet kind. When teachers explained assignments, I listened closely, afraid of misunderstanding. If I wasn't sure about something, I didn't ask questions right away. I waited. I watched how others responded. I measured the tone of the room. If it felt safe, I might speak. If it didn't, I stayed silent. That wasn't shyness, it was strategy. I trusted teachers to teach, but not to handle mistakes gently. I trusted authority, but not consistency. Because I had learned that someone could go from warm to distant without warning, and that distance could last. That made me cautious. I started double-checking everything: my work, my words, my behavior. Mistakes weren't just errors anymore. They were risks. And when you treat mistakes as risks, you stop learning freely. You learn defensively. I remember a time in elementary school when a teacher asked a question I wasn't completely sure about. I had part of the answer, enough to start a conversation, but my hand stayed down. Another student answered instead and got it wrong. The teacher corrected them kindly and moved on. I felt relief. Not because I had avoided embarrassment, but because I had avoided uncertainty. That moment reinforced something in me. It felt safer to stay quiet than to trust how people would respond. Over time, this shaped how I saw authority figures in general: principals, coaches, parents of friends. I didn't see them as people who might support me if I struggled. I saw them as people who decided whether you were good or bad based on moments you couldn't always predict. So I worked hard to stay on the good side. Not through confidence, but through caution. That approach worked well enough that no one questioned it. Adults described me as easy, Teachers called me reliable. Coaches said I was disciplined. Those words sounded positive, but they came with a cost. Because I learned that trust was something you earned by not needing much. I didn't ask for extensions. I didn't explain when I was overwhelmed. I didn't admit when I was confused. I handled things quietly, even when they felt heavy. And the more I did that, the more distant trust felt. Not distant from others, but distant from myself. I stopped checking in with how I felt. I stopped asking whether something was fair or too much. I asked only one thing: can I handle this without causing problems? If the answer was yes, I did. If the answer was no, I still tried. Friendships were affected too, though more subtly. I had friends, good ones, but I didn't fully relax with them. I shared jokes, not worries, stories, not fears, opinions, not needs. When friends argued or made mistakes, I watched closely to see how people reacted. I paid attention to who stayed and who pulled away, because part of me was always collecting evidence of whether trust was safe. When friends disagreed with each other, I felt uneasy, even if I wasn't involved. Conflict felt dangerous, not because I feared yelling, but because I feared what came after. The coldness, the distance, the unspoken shift. So I avoided conflict. I smoothed things over. I apologized quickly, even when I was wrong. I kept the peace. People appreciated that. But again, appreciation isn't the same as trust. I trusted people not to explode. I didn't trust them to stay. That distinction mattered later. At home, my relationship with my father settled into a quiet routine. We weren't fighting, we weren't close either. We existed side by side. He didn't bring up the punishment again. I didn't ask questions. And because no one named what had changed, I assumed the responsibility was mine. I believed I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. That belief made me cautious around him. I didn't share personal struggles. I didn't ask for advice. I didn't test boundaries. I followed rules precisely. Not because I respected authority more, but because I feared losing whatever stability remained. That was the most confusing part. On the surface, things looked fine, but underneath, trust had shifted from something natural to something conditional. I trusted people to like me when I performed well. I didn't trust them to stay when I failed. And that belief didn't disappear with time. It deepened. As I grew older, I noticed how easily other kids reached out for help. They asked questions without hesitation. They admitted confusion without shame. They expected support. I didn't judge them, I envied them, because their trust felt automatic. Mine felt calculated. I didn't realize yet that this wasn't just a personality trait. It was a learned response. A response shaped by one moment where connection changed without explanation. I hadn't lost trust because I was betrayed loudly. I had lost it quietly. And quiet losses are the hardest to recognize, because no one tells you what's missing. You just grow around the absence. By the time I reached my teenage years, trusting carefully felt normal. It felt smart. It felt mature. But it also felt lonely in ways I couldn't explain yet. Because trust isn't just about believing people won't hurt you. It's about believing they'll stay with you when things get uncomfortable. And I hadn't believed that for a long time. Not since that punishment. Not since the silence that followed. By the time I reached my teenage years, trust wasn't something I gave naturally anymore. It was something I evaluated. I didn't walk into relationships assuming safety. I walked in watching for patterns, for signs, for shifts in tone that might tell me when something was about to change. I didn't think of it as mistrust. I thought of it as awareness. Teenage years are usually when people start pushing boundaries, testing limits, figuring out who they are by making mistakes and learning from them. I didn't do much of that. Not because I didn't want to, but because mistakes had stopped feeling educational. They felt dangerous. At school, I became known as someone who never caused problems. Teachers trusted me to follow rules without supervision. They relied on me to be responsible when others weren't. That trust felt good, but it also came with pressure. Because now I wasn't just avoiding punishment, I was protecting an image. If I made a mistake now, it wouldn't just disappoint someone, it would contradict who people thought I was. And that felt risky. So I stayed inside the lines. I didn't speak unless I was sure. I didn't disagree unless it felt safe. I didn't share opinions that might cause friction. I trusted people to like me as long as I stayed predictable. That was the deal I believed we were all making. Friendships during this time were stable but shallow. I had people I laughed with, studied with, spent time with, but I didn't let them see the parts of me that were unsure or afraid. If I felt overwhelmed, I dealt with it privately. If I felt insecure, I masked it with humor or silence. If I felt hurt, I minimized it. I didn't want to test what would happen if I needed too much, because needing too much had once changed everything. Romantic feelings, when they first appeared, were confusing. I wanted closeness. I wanted connection, but I didn't trust it. When someone showed interest in me, part of me felt excited. Another part stayed guarded, waiting for the shift. I paid attention to how quickly people pulled away when things got awkward. I noticed how silence entered conversations after disagreements. I told myself this was normal, but I was constantly preparing for distance. And preparation creates distance all on its own. I remember one specific moment in high school that stands out clearly. A close friend and I had a small disagreement. Nothing dramatic, just a difference of opinion. They expressed frustration. My immediate response wasn't to defend myself. It was to apologize. Not because I thought I was wrong, but because I wanted to stop the tension as quickly as possible. The disagreement passed, but something in me tightened. I had learned that trust required maintenance, that if I wanted people to stay, I had to smooth things over before they had a chance to pull away. That pattern followed me into more relationships. I became the one who compromised first, the one who apologized quickly, the one who avoided difficult conversations. People appreciated that, but appreciation isn't the same as mutual trust. I trusted people to enjoy me when I made things easy. I didn't trust them to stay when things got hard. That belief shaped how I handled authority figures too. Coaches, teachers, employers at part-time jobs. I followed instructions carefully. I didn't question decisions, even when they felt unfair. I didn't advocate for myself, because advocating felt like risk. Risk of being seen as difficult. Risk of changing how someone viewed me. Risk of distance. So I stayed agreeable. From the outside, I looked confident and capable. Inside, I felt constantly alert. My nervous system stayed tuned to other people's reactions. I watched for disappointment the way others watch for danger, because disappointment, in my experience, didn't come with explanation. It came with withdrawal. That made trust feel temporary, like something that could be taken away quietly. As I grew older, I noticed how differently some of my peers handled conflict. They argued openly. They expressed frustration. They trusted that relationships could survive tension. That confused me, because in my internal rulebook, tension meant danger. Not because of yelling, but because of what followed. The silence, the emotional distance. I didn't know how to tolerate that, so I avoided situations that might create it. I chose my words carefully. I chose my actions carefully. I chose my relationships carefully. But no matter how careful I was, anxiety followed. Because when trust is conditional, you're never fully relaxed. You're always monitoring. And monitoring is exhausting. I started feeling tired in ways sleep didn't fix. Tired of thinking ahead. Tired of replaying conversations. Tired of wondering whether I had said too much or not enough. I didn't recognize this as anxiety at the time. I just thought I was responsible. But responsibility driven by fear feels very different from responsibility driven by confidence. One shrinks you, the other expands you. Mine was shrinking me. I didn't realize yet how much this belief about trust would shape my adult life, how it would affect my ability to rely on others, how it would make vulnerability feel unsafe, how connection would turn into something I managed instead of something I experienced. I was still living by a rule written years earlier. If you make a mistake, trust changes. That rule felt true because it had been true once, but it wasn't universally true. I just hadn't learned that yet, because no one had ever shown me what trust looked like after conflict. No one had modeled repair. So I learned caution instead, and caution became my default. It would take leaving childhood behind and facing adult relationships for me to finally question that rule, to ask whether the punishment that taught me to be careful had also taught me something untrue, something that was quietly shaping every relationship I had. For a long time, I believed my problem was simple. I told myself I was just cautious, careful, selective about who I trusted. That explanation worked until it didn't. The cracks started showing when I noticed my reactions didn't match reality. Someone would cancel plans and my chest would tighten as if I'd done something wrong. A friend would take longer than usual to respond, and my mind would immediately search for a mistake I might have made. A boss would sound neutral in an email, and I'd replay my last conversation with them, convinced I had crossed some invisible line. Nothing had actually happened, but my body acted like something had. That disconnect forced me to look deeper. I began asking myself a question I had avoided for years. Where did I learn that trust disappears when people are disappointed? The answer wasn't found in my teenage friendships or adult relationships. It was found much earlier. Back in that moment I rarely revisited, the punishment that came with silence afterward. I had spent years focusing on what I did wrong that day. I told myself the punishment was justified, that I deserved consequences, that my reaction afterward was simply guilt. But guilt fades. What stayed wasn't guilt. It was fear. Fear of the shift that followed. Fear of emotional withdrawal. Fear of not knowing when things were okay again. That's when it clicked. The punishment itself wasn't what changed my relationship with trust. The lack of repair did. No one sat me down afterward and explained expectations. No one reassured me that our relationship was still solid. No one closed the emotional gap that silence opened. So my mind filled in the blanks. I concluded that trust depended on performance, that approval depended on not messing up, that connection could be removed without warning. That conclusion became my blueprint for relationships. Once I saw that clearly, I could finally separate two things I had confused for years: discipline and emotional withdrawal. Discipline corrects behavior. Withdrawal threatens connection. What I experienced wasn't just discipline. It was distance without explanation. And distance is powerful when you're a child. Children don't have the language to question it. They don't have the authority to challenge it. They internalize it. I internalized it as a rule. Don't trust people to stay if you disappoint them. That rule made sense at the time. It protected me from being caught off guard again. But it also quietly shaped my entire emotional life. As I grew older and learned more about psychology, sometimes formally, sometimes through observation, I began to understand something uncomfortable but important. My parent didn't withdraw because I was unworthy of trust. He withdrew because he didn't know how to stay emotionally present in moments of conflict. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with clarity. He wasn't trying to teach me a lesson about trust. He was managing his own discomfort the only way he knew how: silence, distance, control. Understanding that shifted something fundamental, because if the withdrawal wasn't about my worth, then the rule I learned wasn't truth. It was adaptation, and adaptations are meant for specific environments, not entire lifetimes. I started to see how many times in my adult life I was still responding to situations as if I were that child again. When someone seemed disappointed, I pulled back. When conflict appeared, I became overly accommodating. When trust felt uncertain, I withdrew before anyone else could. Not because the situation required it, but because my nervous system remembered the past. That realization was both painful and freeing. Painful because it meant I had been living under a false assumption for years. Freeing because false assumptions can be challenged. I didn't suddenly start trusting everyone overnight. This wasn't a motivational shift. It was a slow, uncomfortable re-education. I began noticing moments where my instinct told me to retreat and choosing deliberately not to. When a friend expressed frustration, I stayed engaged instead of apologizing immediately. When a colleague pointed out an error, I listened without assuming judgment. When a relationship felt tense, I asked questions instead of preparing for distance. Each time I waited for the old consequence, the withdrawal, the silence, the emotional coldness. It didn't come. Not every interaction went perfectly, but connection didn't disappear. That alone challenged the rule I had lived by. I also began to recognize how trust had quietly become transactional in my mind. I trusted people as long as I behaved well. I trusted myself as long as I didn't need much. I trusted relationships as long as nothing went wrong. That's not trust. That's conditional safety. And conditional safety isn't safety at all. It's tension disguised as stability. Once I saw that, I felt grief. Not dramatic grief. Quiet grief. Grief for the years I spent managing relationships instead of experiencing them. Grief for the parts of myself I kept hidden because they felt risky. Grief for the belief that connection had to be earned through perfection. But grief also made space. Space to choose differently. I didn't need my parent to change for this to happen. I didn't need an apology. I needed understanding. Understanding allowed me to reclaim something important. Choice. I could choose to trust based on the present, not the past. I could choose to assess people by their current behavior, not old patterns. I could choose to stay open even when my instinct said to close. That didn't make me reckless. It made me honest. And honesty, I learned, is the foundation of real trust. The punishment that once taught me to be careful had also taught me something untrue. That trust is fragile, that connection disappears quietly, that mistakes make relationships unsafe. Those lessons felt real because they were learned in silence. But silence isn't truth, it's absence, and absence can be misunderstood. Once I understood that, the punishment lost its power. Not because it no longer mattered, but because I finally saw what it really taught me, and more importantly, what it didn't have to keep teaching me anymore. Trust didn't come back to me all at once. It didn't return because I decided to be braver or more optimistic. It came back slowly, in moments so small I almost missed them. It came back the first time I stayed in a conversation even when my chest tightened. It came back the first time I didn't rush to apologize just to keep the peace. It came back the first time I let someone see me unsure without immediately trying to fix it. Each moment felt uncomfortable, exposing, like I was stepping into something without armor. But nothing terrible happened. That realization was subtle, yet powerful. For years, I had believed trust was something fragile, something that could vanish if I said the wrong thing or disappointed the wrong person. I had lived as if connection was conditional, maintained through careful behavior and emotional restraint. Now I was learning something new. Trust isn't built by never making mistakes. It's built by what happens after mistakes. I started noticing how people responded when things didn't go smoothly. A friend misunderstood something I said. Instead of withdrawing, they asked what I meant. A coworker was frustrated with the decision I made. We talked through it. Nothing broke. A relationship hit a moment of tension. We stayed present. We didn't disappear. Each time, the rule I had lived by weakened a little more. The rule that said if you disappoint people, they leave. That rule had shaped my entire emotional world. It had taught me to manage relationships instead of living in them. Letting go of it felt like relearning how to stand on solid ground. There were moments when the old fear still surfaced. A delayed text, a quiet tone, a pause in conversation. My body would react before my mind caught up. I would feel the urge to pull back, to prepare for distance, to protect myself the way I always had. But now, instead of disappearing, I paused. I asked myself a different question. Is this really about the present, or is it about the past? Most of the time, it was the past. That awareness gave me space. Space to breathe. Space to respond instead of react. Space to stay. Staying didn't mean ignoring my feelings. It meant allowing them without letting them control me. I also began noticing how differently I treated myself. For years, I had punished myself internally whenever I made a mistake. I withdrew from my own emotions the same way trust had once withdrawn from me. I became quiet with myself, critical, withholding, unforgiving. Rebuilding trust with others required rebuilding trust with myself, too. I started responding to my own mistakes with curiosity instead of judgment. I asked what went wrong instead of what's wrong with me. That shift softened something deep inside me. It allowed me to see mistakes as information, not threats. That changed everything. As I grew more comfortable staying present during discomfort, my relationships changed. Conversations became deeper, connections felt less fragile. I wasn't constantly bracing for the moment things would fall apart. I didn't need to control every interaction anymore. I could let relationships breathe. One of the most meaningful changes happened quietly. I stopped confusing calm with safety. In the past, calm meant no conflict, no tension, no mistakes, no emotional risk. Now, safety meant something different. It meant being able to speak honestly. It meant trusting that connection could survive discomfort. It meant knowing that silence wasn't the only response to disappointment. I didn't need everything to be smooth to feel secure. I needed it to be real. Eventually, this understanding brought me back to my father. Not physically, but emotionally. I didn't revisit the punishment with him. I didn't confront him about the silence. I didn't need to. I finally understood that his withdrawal wasn't proof that trust disappears when people make mistakes. It was proof that he didn't know how to repair. That understanding released me from carrying his limits as my truth. I could acknowledge the impact of what happened without letting it define my future. The punishment had taught me to be careful, but life taught me something else. That trust isn't something you protect by hiding. It's something you build by staying. If I could speak to the younger version of myself now, the child who learned to trust carefully instead of fully, I would tell him this. You didn't lose trust because you were wrong. You lost it because no one showed you how it could be repaired. And that wasn't your fault. You adapted the best way you knew how. That adaptation kept you safe when you needed it. But you don't have to live there forever. Trust doesn't require perfection. It requires presence. It requires honesty. It requires the courage to stay when things feel uncertain. Today, I still choose my trust thoughtfully, but I no longer withhold it out of fear. I give it based on what I see now, not what I learned long ago. And when I make mistakes, I don't disappear. I stay. Because trust doesn't grow in silence. It grows in what we're willing to face together.